you in advance, for you are our only refuge. We ask this through Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The sitting is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
First of all, we have excuses for absence from Senator Chad Blackman, who is overseas on assignment, and Senator Walker, who is ill. Indications of late arrivals from Senator Maynard, Senator Thompson, and Senator Tate. I have received minutes of our meetings held on Monday, 11th March 2024, and Wednesday, 29th May 2024 to be confirmed. Senator comments.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of our meetings held on Monday, 11th March 2024, and Wednesday, 29th March, also 2024.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
We haven't put the question. The question is that the minutes of our meetings held on 11th March 2024 and 29th May 2024 be confirmed. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, those minutes stand confirmed.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers. Reports from select committees.
Senator Nichols.
May it please you, sir. I have the responsibility to report that the Joint Select Committee on Governance has been actively engaged in the consideration of the two bills sent to it. On the last occasion we met, we were able to conclude the review of all the public submissions that were sent to us, which we received in writing and also by way of the electronic platform, where we interfaced with a number of members of the public at large on this. We also had a meeting with with an officer from the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel to put together recommendations for amendments, and we have concluded that process. However, we are not yet completed. We have submitted the comments to the parent ministry, and the final report is being compiled at this stage. So we will now require a further time to sit and leave from the Senate to do so in order to conclude that business. Yeah, Mr. President, I am being advised by the clerks based on the time to compile the report and for us to have our final meeting, I estimated another 28 days.
So just for the record, two things. Make specific mention of the full name of the committee, so Committee on Governance and Support, the bill under consideration, and the specific date, because we're going an extension to a date. It wouldn't be for X number of days, just for the record and for the formal decision to be made. Thanks.
Yes, certainly, Your Honor. It is the Joint Select Committee, Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters. And the two bills that have been sent for consideration will be Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024. Out of the abundance of caution, I perhaps would request 6 weeks from today's sitting, just to be sure that we can have all of our business concluded before having to come back for another extension. The committee is scheduled to meet on Monday next, where we will go through the revised draft of the bill that was sent back down from the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. And then we will have our formal meeting with the minister, substantive minister responsible for piloting these bills, and then conclude with the report to the Parliament. So I'd like to propose that we have a further extension of 6 weeks to conclude the business of the Joint Parliamentary Select Committee. I so move that motion, Mr. President.
Is there a seconder?
I second, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Watson. The question is that the Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters be granted a requested extension for a period of 6 weeks from the date of today's sitting to submit the report on the matters under consideration, namely the Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The extension is granted to the committee, Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters for a period of 6 weeks from the date of today's sitting.
Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of Articles 45.2, standing orders for 45.2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45.2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next ayes have it. Standing Order 45.2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of the sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. The first reading of the Shipping Domestic Vessels Bill 2024, the first reading of the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill 2024, the first reading also, Mr. President, of the Blue-Green Bank Bill, and that's it, Mr. President.
The question is that the Shipping Domestic Vessels Bill 2024 and the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill 2024 and the Blue-Green Bank Bill 2024 be read a first time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The thanks, the ayes have it. Those bills are accordingly read first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 7, sir.
Order number 7.
Order number 7, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, and which has been assigned to Senator Dr. the Honorable S.M. Monroe Knight, to move the second reading of the Blue-Green Bank Bill 2024.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much for recognizing me as I stand to lead debate on this bill before us this morning. I must say, Mr. President, that I'm actually very proud to be leading this debate on the Blue-Green Bank. I don't know if we fully understand the fact that this is a major innovation in relation to climate finance. And Mr. President, I hope that through my presentation that I can provide more context and a greater understanding of why this is of such importance for us and for the region when we talk about climate finance and the need for innovation, the need for us to be able to mobilize the necessary finances to address the very real threat of the climate impacts that are facing us. Mr. President, there is a growing understanding and acceptance that the climate crisis and its impact is also a climate finance crisis. It is also a climate finance crisis. The question about how governments make room for, plan, budget for, and pay for the impacts of climate is one of the most important and challenging policy questions facing governments and countries worldwide. That is because the climate crisis, we call it an existential crisis. That means it threatens our very existence. It's becoming the single most important challenge and crisis facing governments. And Mr. President, when we talk about that, it may again seem like something that doesn't concern the average person, that it is something that sits above us as individuals, and it is something that governments talk about, that governments need to pay attention to, but not something that impacts the average citizen. So, Mr. President, I want to be able to step back for just a little bit and talk about this whole issue of climate change and climate impact, and what does it mean? Mr. President, I don't think that there is any Barbadian, certainly not the Barbadians that I have met in supermarkets, at the gym, in my workplace. All of us have been feeling the impact of this heightened heat, Mr. President, all of us. And Mr. President, I want to say that I am one of those persons that I sweat all the time. I sweat from my head, a little bit of heat, and I speak sweating. So you can imagine in this environment, how I am suffering. But I think all of us have been commenting on the fact that certainly for this year, we have seen an increase in the heat, in the temperatures. In fact, the analysis that has been done over the period 1984 to 2024, a 36-year period, suggests that May 2024 has been one of the hottest, has been the hottest month recorded over that 36-year period. And that also as well coincides with global averages as well when we look at temperature rises. This year, May 2024, over a 36-year period. Mr. President, that is climate change. And while in Barbados, no one has died from heat stroke, just last week we were learning that well, somebody says let's wait until Kaduma Day, but we cross our fingers and we will ensure, certainly as I wear the hat as Minister with responsibility for culture, as much as possible that we will ensure that there are sufficient measures to prevent that. But Mr. President, just last week we were learning that we had the death of over 1,000 persons that were traveling on their annual pilgrimage to the Mecca. 1,000 persons. In India, people have also died of heat stroke. Right across the US, we're being told that 200 million persons are at threat because of the rising temperatures. Schools are closing and allowing children to go home, again, because of rising temperatures. And even if we in Barbados believe that we can deal with the rising temperatures, I hope that we recognize that there are also other knock-on effects. Because what do? We go out, we purchase fans, we buy air conditioners. What does that mean? It means then that we place more stress on the grid, yeah? Because we are pulling more electricity. But also as well, there's also a household cost as well as we try to make sure that we are as cool as possible, Mr. President. But outside of the heat, Mr. President, right now the farming, the agricultural sector is under a drought warning for the period from January to May. And I have been told, and even though I am still grappling with it, that outside of that drought warning, there's also a hydrological warning as well, which will stay until the end of June, Mr. President. In Mexico and in the US, there are suggestions that very soon we will have a water conflict because over an 80-year treaty between the two, they share water. And unfortunately, because of the drought that is happening, Mexico has not been able to deliver the water that it has promised, and that is creating conflict. And globally as well, we're noting that water is going to become the new commodity for countries to be able to trade. Mr. President, who pays and how do countries mobilize the finance to deal with these issues? How do we mobilize the finance to ensure that the Barbados Water Authority can address the issue of non-revenue water loss, to be able to repair the burst mains, Mr. President, so that we don't lose the precious resource that we need? Mr. President, how do we make sure that we have a resilient housing stock? Who pays for that, Mr. President? Who pays to ensure that, as we have been told, that we are going to have a more intense hurricane season this year? How do we make sure that our island is secure, that homes are secure, businesses are secure, Mr. President? Records and cultural assets are secure. Who pays for that? If you listen to the international narrative, Mr. President, they would suggest that countries like ours, who contribute 0.01% of greenhouse gas emissions that are fueling the climate change, 0.01% is what countries like ours contribute. They would suggest to us that we need to mobilize resources from domestic resources. That is the narrative at play. I participate, as do others in this honorable chamber, in climate negotiations. And that is what they say to us. There was an independent expert group that was established to look at climate finance. And that independent finance group suggested that one of the first measures that countries need to be able to undertake is to mobilize domestic finance. That report, Mr. President, actually went on to say that for developing countries, that there is potential room for taxation. So essentially, what they are saying to us is that in order for countries like ours to be able to mobilize the necessary resources to deal with these very present and urgent climate impacts, that we should look to tax our populations more. That is what they are suggesting. Mobilize your resources, tax your populations in order to deal with the issues of housing, of health, of education, of infrastructure, of water. Mobilize private finance is what they say to us. First, mobilize your private finance resources. Mr. President, I don't think that, some will debate it, but I believe that generally we understand that we still have a developing private finance private sector, who is sometimes very adverse to risky investments. And again, all of the analysis, globally as well as in the region, indicates that the private sector is not flocking to put money into addressing and helping countries to address climate impacts. Because one, for the most part, if you're looking at the issue of mitigation, mitigation is long-term. And also as well, it requires a heavy and intensive amounts of revenue in order to be able to address. Mr. President, there was a report in 2023. It was called Beyond Finance, and it was looking at this issue of the provision of climate finance, particularly for the Global South. And what it showed, Mr. President, is that yes, there is finance that is mobilized, but where is it going? 75% of climate finance that is mobilized is going to the north, to the countries that are the biggest emitters. Finance is going to the north. Moreover, the finance is not only going to the north, it is staying. So that when capital is mobilized from those very same countries, it is staying where it is mobilized in the north. Because again, why? Countries like ours, because we are small, we just don't have the scale in order to be able to attract big private capital to invest. So even as we talk about mitigation, which is, Mr. President, aligned again to what we talk about, transition to renewable energies, clean energy, those require huge amounts of investments and huge amounts of scale. And capital is flocking to those countries that can give them that scale, going to the global north, Mr. President. Mr. President, that report also showed that for the Global South, and when I talk about the Global South, I'm talking about countries like ours within the region, we are financing 61%, Mr. President, of our financing for climate finance is debt. 61%. We have to borrow in order to be able to mobilize the finance that we need, Mr. President, to address some of the issues that I talked about before. The issues of how we deal with our water sector. The issues of our housing stock, Mr. President. The issues of our agriculture. Because if we talk about heat and if we talk about drought, we know that then that is aligned to declining yields within the agricultural sector, Mr. President. Animals need water, Mr. President, to survive. Drought, no water. What happens to our agricultural sector and the plans to be able to grow that agricultural sector as part of the diversification of our economy? So that all of these things are interlinked, and the question of who pays and how countries mobilize the necessary resources. So that report, Mr. President, like I said, showed that for us, we have to be able to mobilize capital through debt. Through debt. 34%, Mr. President, is provided through equity, and only 5% is provided through grants. 5%, only 5% is provided through grants. That is what we are faced with, Mr. President. And we know from previous discussions that when it comes to concessional financing, Mr. President, we are also hamstrung, again, because they tell us because of our GDP that we can't necessarily have access to concessional financing. So small developing countries, not contributing largely to the climate change phenomena, but challenged by it in a real and fundamental way across all sectors, Mr. President, across all sectors that you can think of, challenged by this phenomenon. But then, the options for us to be able to mobilize resources in order to be able to address it are hamstrung. In 2009, under the climate negotiations, those countries that were part of those negotiations agreed, Mr. President, they agreed to provide $100 billion in financing, $100 billion in financing for developing countries to help them address the very challenge that I've been speaking to in 2009. Mr. President, that financing was only delivered 4 years later. They delivered on that promise that they made in 2009 to deliver that $100 billion. Mr. President, it's like your roof is leaking in a major way. It's going to fall in, and you get an estimate for that leak. But you don't spend the money, do a little patches here, you try to patch it there and patch it there. And 4 years later, you then decide that you're going to spend the money, but you're using the same estimate in 2009 in order to be able to get the resources to repay the leak. When that house, that roof, in 2009, because we were just patching, is literally more damaged than it was before. The cracks have gotten larger, Mr. President, and therefore, the analysis again suggests that in order to meet that challenge, we no longer need billions, we actually need trillions. Trillions of dollars, Mr. President. The estimate is that we need approximately $7 trillion annually, globally, in order to be able to deliver the financing that developing countries need to address their mitigation and adaptation needs, and also as well loss and damage, Mr. President. Loss and damage, Mr. President. When we talk about the issue of loss and damage, it is about how countries recover after a disaster. So the money that is available in order for us to be able to recover. And again, under those negotiations, a loss and damage fund was established. But we also recognize that to date, it is still undercapitalized. So there's loss and damage, Mr. President. There's mitigation that I spoke about, again, which is long-term, and again, which has to do with us being able to implement measures that help us deal with lowering those GHG emissions, often through looking at measures, again, that have to do with clean technology, renewable energy, etc. Adaptation measures have to do with how do we address the immediate and future means by which we can protect and build resilience, again, across sectors. So if you look, Mr. President, at it as a leaky boat, if you do adaptation, what you're going to do is, again, try to be able as best as you can to plug those holes as much as you can. If it is that you are doing mitigation, you look for the very source of the leak, Mr. President, and you fundamentally try to address that. Again, but in some instances, that leak can be fixed immediately, and the amount of resources that is needed is going to be huge, Mr. President. And then what happens if the boat hits a storm and it breaks up altogether, and you need to fix it after loss and damage, Mr. President? So we have this estimate in the trillions in order to be able to address the very needs of developing countries in order for them to be able to respond. Again, the question, who pays? How do we mobilize those resources? How do we mobilize the resources when, again, the analysis shows us that even as we know that we have this figure in the trillions, all of the figures indicate that official development financing, what we would call aid, is on the decline. Instead of doubling, is actually declining, Mr. President. The analysis would also as well show us that climate financing, again, is going mainly, as I said before, to mitigation and mitigation in the north. While for many of us, the high need is really for adaptation finance. The application of climate-smart technologies that former Senator Dr. Telston Brathwaite would speak very much about. How do we apply climate-smart measures, again, as an adaptation for the agricultural sector, in order as well for us to be able to adapt? Who pays? Can't tax. We're not supposed to borrow, Mr. President. Can't get concessional finance. The developed world that promised us that they will provide the finance has not done so to scale, even though some people look at that trillion figures and say, well, that's a lot. But remember that there are countries that have spent that amount, one country, in defense alone. One country in defense measures alone. So that trillion globally, Mr. President, even though it would seem like a lot because we're talking about millions of trillions of dollars, is really, when you look at it, really achievable. And this is exactly why the Bridgestone Initiative came about, in order to be able to provide a pathway for how this financing needs to be allocated, needs to be mobilized, and to address the fundamental issue of how we ensure that the global architecture is reformed. And Mr. President, again, one of the reasons why I say that I was proud when I began to be able to lead off this debate is because the only way for us, again, as a small country, to address this issue of how do we mobilize finances, how do we make sure that we have the adequate resources, is that we must innovate. Mr. President, we must innovate. Barbados, Mr. President, if you look at the recently, I don't even think it has been released as yet, the 2024 Sustainable Development Report, Barbados is #1. Barbados is #1 on the multilateralism index. We are leading the world. This little country is leading the world in multilateralism as we provide leadership for how we will achieve the UN goals. This little country, Barbados. And it is primarily because we have given to the world, again, innovations in how we will mobilize finance. Mr. President, we would have learned already here that Barbados was one of the first countries to issue natural disaster clauses in its financing mechanisms. we would have debated and passed the Debt for Nature swap here in Barbados. The government is looking at climate swaps, Mr. President. And now we have the Blue-Green Bank, another plank of innovation in helping us to be able to mobilize the resources that are necessary in order to address, as I said before, the existential threat of climate. Because it is important for us, given all that we have learned about what is happening within the climate finance arena, to make sure that as a country, because we understand the fight that we are in, that we cannot just depend on the promises of the international community, but that we must create pathways of our own in order to be able to finance and to protect, Mr. President, our populations. Mr. President, I don't know, again, if we realize how fundamental this issue is. In Panama, people have had to be removed this year, from one of the small islands from Panama because of high sea level rises. Whole island, people have had to be removed, Mr. President. The danger of becoming climate refugees. Imagine, Mr. President, that we have a Category 4, Category 3 hurricane in Barbados in our current condition and the impact. And again, Mr. President, how do we rebuild? Who pays? How do we mobilize the resources? And the Blue-Green Bank is one of those mechanisms that the government is engineering in order for us to be able to mobilize the necessary capital. And Mr. President, I want to say that it is not just Barbados, we are innovating, but globally, countries are looking at various ways in order to be able to innovate and to mobilize this capital. Developed countries, Mr. President, across Europe in particular, are introducing carbon taxes. There is discussions, Mr. President, about a shipping tax to be able to tax, again, those large cargo ships that give off a lot of emissions. But Mr. President, guess what? Even though there is emerging consensus around that, what they are saying is not for the money to be shared to help us to be able to adapt and mitigate. They want to keep the money because they are saying it is important for them to clean up their act again. So they pollute, but then they also win, Mr. President. There's the development of carbon markets, Mr. President. Green bonds. So a whole number of instruments we see globally as people try to make sure that they can crowd in the necessary finance in order to be able to make sure that we can meet that figure, be able to address the need for the climate finance that is ever so urgent. So that we face, Mr. President, a different kind of environment that we had before. And therefore, that different kind of environment requires that we need to be able to have different ways of how we are able to tackle it. And I understand that for some, dealing with innovation and dealing with new ways of mobilizing capital can seem, it's different, can seem challenging. When we are faced with the difference and the unknown, we can tend, Mr. President, to want to be able to retract. But, Mr. President, this government believes strongly that one of the critical planks that we have to be able to employ, as I said before, is innovation. It is innovation. The Blue-Green Bank, and Mr. President, it is intended to help us do a number of things. It is intended to help us mobilize the climate finance from different resources. So it's intended to be able to help us to crowd in finance from international development partners as well, corporations, Mr. President, large investors, under an umbrella that is also intended to be transparent, because you would know again from the bill before us that is intended to operate again with minimal government interference, Mr. President. I want to say that, minimal government interference. It will be governed by a board of directors, and yes, the government will be able to appoint some of those directors, but those directors will operate independently. If you will look, Mr. President, at the bill, at Section 7 and Section 8, we will know that the bill sets specific parameters, again, in terms of the operations of the bank, in terms of how it can lend. It actually sets thresholds in terms of its risk profile, Mr. President, in order to make sure that the blue-green bank functions, one, again, transparency, but also as well doesn't put us at risk, again, in terms of the larger debt profile. I also want to make it clear, Mr. President, that when it came to financing of this bank, we were able to attract, first of all, financing from the Green Climate Fund to develop the concept note and the parameters for the Blue-Green Bank through technical assistance, a technical assistance grant, meaning the government did not put any money as we sought to build out the framework for how the Blue-Green Bank would operate. Mr. President, part of the financing for the bank is $15 million from the government. But again, that $15 million is not new debt. That $15 million was part of a loan from the IMF under the Resilience Fund that the government signed in 2022, when it signed $183 million US, Mr. President. And we had agreed to be able to put aside that $15 million for investment in the Blue-Green Bank. So we are not incurring new debt in order to invest in the Blue-Green Bank. Mr. President, but we have others who have come on board in order to invest and to capitalize the Blue-Green Bank. The U.S. through the USAID has agreed to fund $2.5 million US to help with startup capital. Again, the Green Climate Fund has invested another $15 million US as well, again, to help with the startup cost for that bank. We have, Mr. President, Guyana, Bahamas investing. We have as well, Mr. President, CAF, the IDB. And what that shows is the level of confidence, Mr. President, that is being placed in this mechanism, so that to date, we have $77.5 million in startup capital. And the intent is that we will continue to be able to look for additional investors in order to continue the capitalization of the bank, Mr. President. Importantly, the intent of the bank is to allow us to be able to fund and invest in areas that have to do with, as I said before, equally mitigation and adaptation. Because I said there is a tendency to put money into mitigation globally as opposed to adaptation. Explicitly, the fund makes provision that the funds have to be applied across the board equally to address both the mitigation challenge and the adaptation challenge as well. Mr. President, if we look at the areas, again, under Clause 7, that identifies the areas of how the bank is supposed to function and what it is to invest in, you would see that essentially it is to allow us Mr. President, to address those very things that I started asking about who pays and how do we pay and how do we mobilize the capital. The investments, the money put into the Blue-Green Bank will help us, and I say us, Mr. President, not the government, but society, be able to address, again, building that resilient housing stock, addressing infrastructure challenges, those very burst mains that I talked about from the Barbados Water Authority, and making sure that those mains that are 130 years old, that unfortunately, Mr. President, still we're using today. And every day, Mr. President, unfortunately, I wake up again to an alert of another burst main, Mr. President. Pains the heart. But again, that is a cost for a heavily subsidized Barbados Water Authority. A heavily subsidized Barbados Water Authority, and therefore, as well, is not in a position to be able to garner its own finance. So the government needs to be able to continue to finance it. So we're establishing a mechanism that would be able to crowd in that finance. And most importantly, not just crowd in the finance, but be able to lower the cost of the finance by leveraging all of the players within the international market in order to be able to do that, because that's an important part of the equation. One of the challenges that we face is the high cost, Mr. President, the high cost of the finance. And the Blue-Green Bank provides us with a way that we can be able to bring down that cost of finance. And it is intended that some of the resources that will be applied, Mr. President, will be applied through grants, Mr. President. Grants for projects that are intended to help women, intended to help households, Mr. President, as we transition from our diesel cars to our electric cars, Mr. President. Again, as we would have heard the Minister of Finance talk about, being able to support the taximen and the ZR drivers who also want to be able to transition. And now having a tool, the bank, that can help us to be able, again, to leverage that finance, crowding that finance, bringing that finance, that would help us now to be able to invest in some of those real things. The investment that is needed in making sure that we get our program, again, Mr. President, for making sure that we can provide low-cost, resilient housing as an essential pillar for empowerment, because the things go together and they should not be seen as separate. One of the things with the issue and our challenge of climate, the climate challenge, the climate crisis, is that it is also as well tied up in terms of how we deal with and address all of those measures that are housed under the Sustainable Development Goals. Education, health, sustainable cities, Mr. President. Simple everyday things like making sure that we have good drainage, so that again, when we have those floods, that we can let the water run off. Mr. President, all of those things cost. And with an environment in which we are constrained about how we can mobilize those finances, the government is using this instrument as a way for us, like I said before, to be able to signal, one, again, to that global financial architecture, to those development partners, but also as well to persons involved in philanthropy. Because we want also as well to attract philanthropic money, Mr. President. Persons out there who are willing to give, and to give to the cause of addressing the climate crisis. So that again, we have a transparent instrument that would allow us to be able to do so. Mr. President, finally, one of the other elements of this bank that I want to be able to focus on as well is that while the bank will not provide for it, will not operate, Mr. President, like a normal retail bank that you would see on Broad Street. It will not operate in the same way as a CIBC, as a Scotia Bank. It is intended, as I keep saying, to be able to crowd in large amounts of capital, particularly whether it is from other governments, development partners, corporations, and the like. What it does provide for is that as we prioritize as a government those areas that have to do with allowing us, again, to be able to address the most pressing issues, that it does allow for us to be able to finance those projects and programs, Mr. President, that unfortunately, without being able to tax and being able to get concessional financing, we would have found it hard to be able to finance them. We can now house those under this instrument. And again, a transparent instrument that will provide for, again, an analysis of whether the project will deliver, and then, Mr. President, allowing as well for that financing, again, to be provided. So it means that, again, if you have groups, whether there are taxi operators who can come together, again, lobby government, lobby a government agency in order to prepare a proposal, that they have the opportunity, Mr. President, to be able to have an opportunity to be financed under this banking mechanism. So that, again, even though it does not function like a retail bank, the opportunities for it to be able to benefit Barbadians, Mr. President, is very real in its operations. And that, Mr. President, is something that I want to ensure that we fully understand. Mr. President, as I close, and as I commend this bill to this honorable chamber, I want to be able, again, to reiterate that point that I made at the beginning, is that as government is constrained, and as we look for new mechanisms, we cannot run from the fact that we will have to do things that are different. We will have to do things that perhaps we don't always recognize. But that search is not singularly us. It is happening throughout the globe. But what we are fashioning here under this Blue-Green Bank is a mechanism that works for us. It is a mechanism that allows us not to be just at the mercy of the promises of the international financial architecture, of the promises of aid, of the promises of those countries that said that they will deliver, and the history shows that they will under-deliver. But again, this provides a mechanism not only for us in Barbados, but to benefit right across the region in order for us to protect our own. Mr. President, I'm obliged, and I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my first remarks today are of a housekeeping nature. Mr. President, I am somewhat concerned, and I know similar concerns have been expressed in this chamber before, certainly before I was here, about the schedule that we are expected to keep this week in the Senate. We are going to meet twice this week, Mr. President, and we are expected to debate several bills.